Now, despite this meant to be a quick, simple project, I felt that the muff on its own was going to look a little bare. They always seem to have a matching fur stole or capelet, or something rather lovely to be worn with them. And so I started thinking, what could I do? I mean, the simplest thing would have been to have made just a strip of velvet like a stole and wrap it around the neck. But I started to think about the shapes of the 1890s, and thinking back to this pattern I had here, which is from many, many years ago, from Tudor Tailor pattern testing. It's the partlet pattern, which is a very nice shaped partlet for the 16th century. But this outer layer with the curve makes a really nice sort of caped, rounded version. So I just started playing with that. So I kept the line. So I kept the line of the shoulder, but elongated just a little bit, and then down to a point here, and then back up to the neck. I also made the neck just a little bit higher if you compare the original. So I think it's sat like that, and I've just gone up a little bit, but not even that much. No, not even that much, just up a little bit and down for the neck. And then this is the back. I mean, it looks like I'm cutting out bat signals, really, doesn't it? I did the same, just a tiny bit less at the back neck, a little bit higher at the shoulder. And so my plan is to cut this in velvet. I think I might need to cut a tiny bit of stiffening, and then this can be sort of worn folded back with some fastenings here. I start laying out my fabric with the pile of the velvet going up the garment, so that the colour should be deep and intense when you're looking straight on. So both of my pattern pieces are lying in the same direction, and I match the selvage at the centre front and the fold on the centre back panel. Once it's firmly pinned in place, I can start marking out my seam allowances, 1/2 inch on the shoulders and neck and side edges, and a 1 inch or the whole of the selvage at the centre front. I then cut out both pieces just using my scissors. I'll decide how to finish the raw edges of the velvet later. Not having quite enough pink silk to line the stole to match the muff, I've resorted to a nice remnant of cotton sateen left over from making pockets. Well, it's somebody else's remnant that I've then used to make pockets. Waste not, want not. And a cotton sateen will give it a nice weight to the lining and also give it some grip, so it also won't just go sliding off my shoulders. Where if I lined it in silk, there'd be a danger of that. To cut out the lining pieces, I just lay my velvet panels on top and use them as a pattern to cut round. In a lightweight fusible interfacing, I've also just cut a little centre front and back neck support facing. I'm not quite sure which you would call it, but this is just to give the turn back area and the collar just a little bit of body, and that's me ironing it in place now. Because I don't have a velvet board, I lay a piece of velvet that's not being used on my ironing board and then iron the garment face down on it so as not to crush the pile. Now that the interfacing is in place, I can match my shoulder seams on the velvet and on the lining. Making sure that my seam allowance guide is set to 1/2 inch, I just seam the shoulders of the lining and the body together. starting with the lining seams, I clip into the curves at the neckline to remove some of the seam allowance, and snip into the curves in the other direction on the shoulder seam and press them open over a ham, making sure not to crush and crease the garment, but to work with the curves. And then I do exactly the same on the velvet layer, making sure that I've already put some velvet over my ham, and then clipping into those curves and clipping away any extra seam allowance at the beginning and end of the seam, and press that open gently. And here is a dress form, wearing a corset of a completely different era, or today's rather. Just checking that it sort of will fit over the collar, over the shoulders, how I want it to. And actually I thought I hadn't added enough flare at the back neck, but I think when that seam allowance is gone, we'll just about get away with it. So I should really have probably drafted another sort of more Medici stand collar, but I think we're going to get away with it. So now I'm going to stay stitch all around this outer curved edge of the hem, because I should have done that first, and then I'm going to bag out around the neckline with the lining, and I might end up finishing the rest of the hem by hand, just because I'll have more control over the velvet, because if I bag it out sometimes you can sort of stretch and pull a bit too much. Still looking rather bat-like. Here is the hem pinned all the way up to the neck, around the collar and back down again. So I'm going to bag that out, turn it through, press it, make sure it folds nice, and then decide exactly how I'm going to finish off this hem, which has now got a stay stitch around it, which I still think I'm going to just turn that in and hand sew the hem, but let's have a look. I then just machine straight up the centre fronts, around the neckline and back down the other side, so that it can all be turned through with a neat finish. I cut the centre front seam allowance down to 1/2 inch, and then round the curve of the neckline I cut it down to 1/4 inch, perhaps even smaller. I got a bit gung-ho, to be honest, and I'm using my pinking shears because I thought that might mimic the way that you cut into a curve. I then pressed the centre front seams open to get the neat finish, and then both seam allowances to the lining side and the same along the neckline. I then smooth with my fingers that finished edge so that the lining sits just inside of the centre front, and then working with my fingers and the iron, pressing it flat, and then working over the ham to keep the curves going in the directions that you want, so you're not just squashing everything, that it's going to be a neat finished, and because there isn't any tailoring in it, it just means that the collar will sit in the direction that I want and hope, well, that's the plan anyway. Alright, in a fit of no particularly good reason why, I have bagged out the back hem like that with the machine, but I have turned the front edge in and pinned the lining up. I'm just going to slip stitch that in place, and it looks a bit medieval, unsurprisingly, even though it's based on a 16th century partlet. But I think with a hook and eye here, I think these are actually going to have to dangle apart, but I really like the idea of putting like a tassel on the end of each of those, and then to stop it riding up, I think it needs a tassel with maybe a weight on the end there. So, I mean, to be honest, it looks a bit rushed, and this is a fine example of me hand sewing something meticulously and then getting an idea and completing the outfit with something quite rushed and machine sewn. But I think to wear over another jacket and to sort of complete the look, it'll be fine. I neatened the centre fronts down to the points with a little slip stitch. And then I sew a hook on one side and do a small worked bar on the other. I then repeat this, but the other way round. So a hook next to the bar and a bar next to the hook, so hopefully when they are done up, the two will interlock. This turned out to be really troublesome when trying to fasten on your own. Maybe don't do that. Maybe go for a slightly bigger hook. Now, at this stage, I wore the capelet to photograph and film the muff, but I didn't feel it was quite finished. So after that, I looked into making some tassels to decorate the centre front and the back point. Although you can make tassels without a bead, I thought it would be quite fun to do one that had sort of a decorative bead at the top and then the tails of the tassels falling from that. So I had a look at what I've got bead-wise, and although I really like these ones, I think the bigger one's going to look more impressive. So I'm going to have a play around with those. I bought some chenille yarn from De Vere Silks and then their embroidery silk in a equivalent of 6-strand embroidery thread and 3-strand embroidery thread. Just to see what I didn't think these would cover the bead or make the tassel very economically, but I have another plan for those in the future. And the chenille looks, I don't know if you can see because it's brown on brown, but I really like how that looks covering the large bead. And then I've put some extra strands of brown embroidery silk on top, which for me, alright, it's pretty dull for everybody else, but for me that's exactly the effect I want. Although I'm going to run off a nice long length of chenille. Get a darning needle. Get a darning needle, which actually says it's a chenille needle, so it's got a sharp end, but a blunt end would work just as well. Thread all those 2 ends through there, so I'm working double thread. Make sure there's no tangles. And then start covering my wooden bead. Well, if I don't get into a horrible tangle, that is. Here's one of my covered beads, and I'm just threading up a needle with some of the brown silk twist. Put a knot at the end, and I'm just going to fasten that into the inside of the bead. And I just thought it might look nice to have a little bit of textural contrast, but because I have picked such similar colours, it doesn't actually show up that much, but there we are. Sometimes I really have to experiment and actually see what something looks like to then go, oh no, that's not actually interesting enough. However, the reason I picked chenille is because I wanted the tassels to blend in with the velvet rather than be very shiny, or I wanted to keep with the matte look. So let's carry on because the silk's not adding anything in particular. So I'm just wrapping a few strands of silk round. I'm just doing this by eye, sort of seeing where they go, sort of dividing it up into segments in a way. But you know, if you wanted to count and do exactly 12 or divide it into quarters and go from there, that's up to you. But I'm just going to stick with doing it by eye. There we are, just room for one more. There. I'm going to leave that silk thread to sew the tassel on with. Can you even see it? Just about. Anyway, there we are. Now it's time to actually make the tassel length. And for that, you just need to cut a piece of cardboard that is the length that you want the tassels to be. Well, probably a little bit longer than you want them to be. And then get the chenille, wrap it around, tie a little knot, and then you just do this until it looks thick enough. A sensible person which is not me, would count how many times they wrap it around the cardboard so you can make all your tassels the same thickness. So I probably should pay attention now as to how many of these I do. Alright, so I'm going to wrap the chenille around itself to try and keep that bit tight at the top, but not too tight because it does just snap if you put it too tight. Bend the cardboard, slide it off. I'm going to do that one more time just so that the tassel ends are secure inside the bead. And now I'm just going to cut through that end. Give it a shake. And there's my tassel, which I've made 3 of them like that now. They weren't quite what I had in mind. I think it's because they're chenille, they're a bit heavier and not very subtle, but they are nice and matte. Possibly looks a little bit like I'm making little, I don't know, dollies of which might stick pins in. I don't know. Anyway, they're ready to sew onto the cape now. Here's the point of the little capelet. Here's a tassel, and I'm just going to use that silk thread and sew it on there. And I think I'll go through all the way again. Just because I also fiddle with things, so if I don't sew it on securely, I'll probably find myself fiddling with it and breaking the thread, which is why I'm using the silk thread, not the chenille as well. So I sew both the tassels on the centre front and one on the centre back in exactly the same way. And I realise now, because I've gone for the velvet and the fluffy chenille, it does look quite similar to the little animal tails that you sometimes see on fur capes and fur muffs. So I'm quite pleased with the effect, that it's something sort of similar to the Edwardian era without actually causing horrendous cruelty to small furry animals.